This is a new podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating journey. We're using the stack of sources you've provided, articles, research, notes, to sort of peel back the layers on Nepal's complex geopolitical situation. Just picture this, a small, landlocked nation, right, nestled tightly between two absolute giants, India to the south, China to the north. And it's more than just geography, really. It's the heart of what some are calling the Great Eurasian Solitaire. Or even a new great game, only this time there's a powerful third player it's really changed the whole dynamic, the United States. So our mission today is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from all this material we have. We want to help you grasp Nepal's incredibly strategic position, understand the ambitions of these big external powers, and crucially, look at Nepal's own deep domestic vulnerabilities. The big question we're kind of asking is, in this high-stakes game, can Nepal ever truly be an independent player? Or is it sort of doomed to remain a pawn? Okay, let's unpack this. So, Nepal's unique geographic situation, it's famously been described as a yam between two boulders.
Right.
And as our sources really lay out, these aren't just, quaint geological features anymore. They've become the actual tectonic plates of global politics.
Exactly.
And Nepal's caught right in that squeeze.
Yeah. And what's truly fascinating here is how Nepal has historically tried to navigate this incredibly tricky position. Officially, they adopt a foreign policy of non-alignment.
Okay.
It's rooted in principles like Pancha Shila from the Bandung Conference days.
Right, Bandung.
But the thing is, it's not just some ideological choice. It's really a strategic necessity, born directly from its geography.
Makes sense.
The real challenge, though, is maintaining that delicate neutrality in today's world, this increasingly multipolar world where global competition just ramps up Nepal's geostrategic importance. It's incredibly difficult not to get pulled in multiple directions.
And the central thesis, the core argument of the analysis we're diving into, it really hammers this home, doesn't it? Nepal's fate isn't just about the foreign policy choices it tries to make.
No, not at all.
It's mainly determined by this complex interplay between the strategic ambitions of these outside powers and Nepal's own deep domestic vulnerabilities. It's like two sides of the same coin.
Precisely. Our sources, they highlight significant cracks right there in the state's foundations. We're talking chronic political instability, a very fragile economy, and acute climate threats.
Okay.
These aren't just background noise. These are vulnerabilities that external actors are incredibly adept at exploiting, to advance their own interests.
Right.
It's why even seemingly beneficial international projects, whether it's China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, or the U.S.'s Millennium Challenge Corporation, the MCC, they often become points of intense domestic fighting and geopolitical leverage.
It's an incredibly intricate chessboard. Let's maybe start breaking down the main strategies of these key players. Like these sources outline. India first. What's their play?
Okay, India. Their main goal is fundamentally about maintaining strategic dominance in what they see as their sphere of influence. It's about ensuring their border security and, critically, controlling the water resources that originate up in Nepal and flow down into the Ganges Basin. Water is huge. They're levers of influence. They're deeply ingrained. You've got that unique open border, overwhelming trade supremacy. They are Nepal's largest trading partner by a mile. Hydroelectric agreements, and those profound cultural and familial ties often summed up in that phrase, roti beti.
Right, the bread and daughter relationship.
Exactly. But for Nepal, this carries inherent risks. There's the potential for economic blockades like we've seen, there's direct political interference, and even a subtle kind of creeping loss of sovereignty over its own vital natural resources.
And China. What's the dragon's long game here, according to the sources?
Well, for Beijing, the main goals seem to be border security, especially for Tibet, which is paramount, and then expanding its economic and political influence throughout the Himalayas and directly countering the influence of both India and the USA.
Okay.
They're key levers. The Belt and Road Initiative, obviously, offering infrastructure loans, some military aid, and this ambitious plan to create alternative trade routes, trying to fundamentally change Nepal's landlocked status.
Transformative potential, then.
Potentially.
Yeah.
But the risks for Nepal are equally significant. You've got the potential for a debt trap, which people worry about a lot, a gradual erosion of sovereignty through economic dependence, maybe, and definitely increased geopolitical tensions with India. It heats things up.
And then we have the United States, which, as you said, has really emerged as this third power player, dramatically changing the dynamics. What's Washington's approach?
The USA's main goal is pretty clear for the materials. containing China's expanding influence. That's number one.
Hmm.
Also promoting democratic values and establishing a strategic foothold in the Himalayas.
And their tools.
Their primary levers include the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the MCC grant we mentioned, substantial USI programs, which have been there a long time, and fitting it all into the broader Indo-Pacific strategy.
Okay.
For Nepal, though, this introduces a very real risk, getting drawn into a proxy conflict between these great powers. Plus, the inherent unpredictability and sometimes inconsistency of U.S. foreign policy, that's a factor too.
Okay. Here's where it gets really interesting and maybe the most complex part. Nepal's relationship with India. It isn't just important. The sources call it the absolute bedrock of its foreign policy and economy,
Yeah.
described as an inseparable and complex connection, right? Cemented by like 1,000 years of shared history, common culture, and that unique open border that really gives meaning to that roti-beti concept we just talked about.
It's incredibly deep, but that deep kinship contrasts really sharply with India's undeniable economic dominance.
Yeah.
Just to give you a sense of the scale here, India accounts for over 2/3 of Nepal's merchandise trade.
Wow.
2/3. They're its largest source of foreign direct investment. And get this, India supplies literally 100% of Nepal's petroleum products.
100%. That's staggering.
It is. And in the last fiscal year covered by the sources, nearly 4/5, like 79% of Nepal's total exports went straight to India.
So it's not just dependence, you called it an economic umbilical cord.
No.
That gives New Delhi just enormous leverage.
Huge leverage. And the most striking, maybe even brutal example of that leverage was that unofficial economic blockade back in 2015.
Right, I remember that.
This wasn't some minor trade spat. It was India's response to Nepal's new constitution, which Delhi felt didn't adequately protect the interests of the Matizi people along the border.
Okay.
The blockade just absolutely paralyzed Nepal's economy. It pushed Kathmandu to desperately seek alternatives with China. It was a really stark lesson in who held the economic power.
Yeah, a very harsh lesson.
That blockade really showed how India is willing to weaponize its economic power strategically. Now, let's shift focus slightly to hydropower, because this has become a main battleground, and it's where India, according to the analysis, has pulled off a true geopolitical masterclass.
Okay, hydropower. I know Nepal has huge potential there.
Immense potential. Theoretically, 83,000 megawatts.
Yeah.
Economically viable, maybe 42,000 megawatts. Could be an energy powerhouse for all of South Asia.
Right.
But India's primary interest, it seems, isn't just buying electricity. It's about controlling Nepal's vast water resources. These are absolutely crucial for regulating the Ganges Basin downstream, especially with Himalayan glaciers melting faster and faster. This is really about future water security for India.
So it's not just energy, it's about controlling the flow of water, basically life itself downstream.
Exactly.
And this is where that masterclass comes in.
Right. In 2018, India simply adopted a policy. They refused to buy electricity from any projects in Nepal that had Chinese participation. Any.
Wow. Okay, just flat out refusal.
Flat out. Think about the implications of that for a minute. It might seem like just a commercial decision, right? We won't buy from these guys.
Yeah.
But it effectively neutralizes China's main advantage, their ability to fund and build big infrastructure in Nepal's most valuable economic sector. It makes any Chinese-backed hydropower project potentially unprofitable because it loses access to its only major viable market, India.
So India just closed the door.
Completely closed the door.
Right.
And as a direct result, Nepal is kind of compelled to hand over major projects to Indian companies instead. The $900 million Uran III mega project, for example, now being developed by India's state-owned SJVN Limited.
Oh.
Other big projects like West SETI, which China was interested in for years, they face a similar fate. India has, in essence, transformed its energy market into a really powerful strategic tool, securing its own critical water and energy interests while effectively containing Chinese influence right in its strategic backyard. It's a very clever, very effective move.
Okay, let's move on to China then. The Chinese Dragon's Gambit, particularly under the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, it presents this very tempting alternative, right? An escape from Indian hegemony, promising to transform Nepal from landlocked to potentially land-linked. For a country so dependent, that's got to be an incredibly attractive proposition.
Oh, it is, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the reality, as the sources show, is that progress on BRI in Nepal has been incredibly slow. They joined back in 2017, but it's been bogged down largely due to internal political squabbling in Nepal
Right.
and very real funding disputes between Kathmandu and Beijing.
Okay.
It was only in December 2024, quite recently, that a new framework agreement was finally signed, identifying potential projects like roads, maybe that cross-border railway,
Yeah.
an industrial park. But the pace has been glacial compared to the initial hype.
And the main stumbling block, as the sources seem to highlight again and again, it remains financing, right?
Absolutely. Nepali concerns about the debt trap are very real. They look at Sri Lanka's experience with Chinese loans, Hambantota Port, and all that.
Yeah, that's the cautionary tale.
It really is. So Kathmandu insists on grants, or maybe highly concessional loans, while Beijing often offers rather vague financial assistance, which doesn't necessarily rule out those high-interest commercial loans. It's a classic standoff over terms.
And Pokhara International Airport seems like a key example of this whole dynamic.
It really is. It was built with a $216 million Chinese loan. Beijing actively promotes it as a BRI success story.
Right.
Yet it faces significant commercial difficulties. Why? Because India still refuses to provide new air corridors over its territory, so not many international flights can actually use it effectively.
Ah, so India's counter pressure again.
Exactly, another clear instance. Plus, there was that whole scandal when the Chinese embassy just unilaterally declared the airport was part of BRI. Kathmandu pushed back, saying the agreement actually predated Nepal officially joining BRI. It just shows how these big infrastructure projects become symbolic battlegrounds, not just straightforward economic ventures.
And the trade relationship itself with China, it's incredibly asymmetric, isn't it?
Hugely. In the first 11 months of the 2023-24 fiscal year, the sources say trade turnover was over $700 million.
Okay.
But Nepalese exports to China, a tiny fraction, about $12.3 million, compared to nearly $700 million in imports from China.
Wow, that's a massive imbalance.
It's staggering. And that imbalance only deepens Nepal's economic dependence, even as it diversifies away from India slightly. China's also stepping up military cooperation. They have joint Sagarmatha friendship exercises. They supply some military equipment. For Beijing, this is mainly about strengthening border security with Tibet and just solidifying its position in the region. Overall, China's strategy in Nepal looks like a long-term play. It's probably not about immediate economic gain. It's more about gradually reshaping the geopolitical reality on the ground.
Yeah.
By building things like the Trans-Himalayan network, China aims to eventually break India's monopoly on Nepal's external access. Even if these new routes are more expensive or difficult, their mere existence gives Kathmandu a bit more strategic leverage, and it diminishes the effectiveness of future potential Indian blockades. It's a slow game.
Okay, now let's bring in that Western joker, as the sources sometimes frame it, the United States. Its return, or maybe its increased focus on the Himalayan arena as a third power player, has really added a new layer of complexity, hasn't it? Dramatically changing the strategic balance.
It really has.
Washington's strategy seems openly aimed at containing China's influence, and its flagship project until recently was the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the MCC.
That's right. The MCC program, it was positioned as a significant grant, $550 million from the U.S., plus another $197 million from Nepal itself, all earmarked for really vital power grid upgrades and road infrastructure.
Sounds good on paper.
Exactly. And Washington deliberately presented it as this transparent, no-cost alternative to China's often opaque BRI loans. The idea was to bolster Nepal's economic independence and resilience.
But the MCC quickly spiraled into a massive political firestorm in Nepal. Why did that happen?
Well, the main reason was because U.S. officials, at various points, explicitly linked the MCC grant to the broader U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, the IPS.
Ah, the strategy aimed at China?
Precisely. And that linkage immediately gave powerful ammunition to opponents within Nepal, particularly the leftist and communist parties, and of course China itself was happy to amplify those concerns. They fiercely denounced the MCC. They called it a covert military alliance, a blatant violation of Nepal's sovereignty, and a betrayal of its cherished policy of non-alignment.
So it became deeply politicized.
Extremely. It took years of intense debate, backroom deals, even street protests before it was finally ratified by Nepal's parliament in February 2022. It was a really brutal political fight.
And then just when things seemed settled.
Then came the shock of the suspension in early 2025. The sources note the new Trump administration made this stunning decision to suspend all MCC payments and other USAID funds too, pending an audit.
Wow, after all that effort to get it ratified.
Exactly. And this move had profound and frankly disastrous consequences for the U.S. position in Nepal. It was widely seen as a huge breach of trust. It basically confirmed the worst fears of critics about U.S. unreliability and unpredictability.
Undermining their own arguments.
Completely.
Yeah.
Handed Beijing and its supporters a major propaganda victory on a silver platter. They could just point and say, see, even free Western money comes with massive political strings and instability.
And most critically, I guess, it created a strategic vacuum, didn't it? Which China will inevitably try to fill.
Absolutely. It leaves Nepal in a really difficult position. For a small state like Nepal caught between these giants, the lesson seems to be that even gratuitous aid, even grants, come with a really high geopolitical price tag. It seems the U.S. maybe seriously underestimated Nepal's deep internal divisions and just how easily its actions could be spun politically. This suspension might have inadvertently pushed Nepal even closer towards China's orbit, ironically.
Right. What stands out to you most about the U.S. role here?
I think it's the volatility. The shift from pushing MCC so hard, framing it as vital, to then suspending it abruptly. For a small country trying to navigate these huge powers, that kind of unpredictability is really destabilizing. It makes the long-term planning almost impossible.
So we've looked quite a bit at the external pressures from these global giants, India, China, the U.S. But what does all this really mean for Nepal itself? Our sources make it really clear that the true source of Nepal's profound vulnerability isn't just the outside pressure, it's its own deep internal cracks. This creates what one analysis aptly called a vulnerability vortex, a kind of self-reinforcing negative cycle.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The political instability is just Exhibit A. It's like a constant game of musical chairs. The sources mentioned 13 different governments in just the past 17 years.
13 and 17 years, that's incredible.
It is. And this chronic instability leads to a profound lack of coherent long-term policy. It discourages both domestic and foreign investment. Who wants to invest when the rules might change next month?
Right.
And crucially, it makes Nepal an easier target for external influence. Each new, fragile coalition tends to reverse the decisions of the previous one, especially on these big foreign-funded projects. It just creates endless delays and uncertainty.
And then there's the whole issue of the remittance economy and the youth exodus. This sounds really serious.
It is extremely serious. Nepal is dangerously dependent on money sent home by migrant workers. Remittances accounted for about 25% of its GDP in 2023, a quarter of the entire economy.
Wow.
And this isn't just a statistic, it's a direct consequence of the country failing to create enough quality jobs at home. This leads to a massive outflow of its brightest and youngest people. Get this number. In just one fiscal year, 2020-23, over 771,000 young Nepalese were granted work permits to go abroad.
Over 750,000 in 1 year.
In 1 year. Meanwhile, youth unemployment back home reached over 20% in 2023. This is literally a country shipping out its future workforce.
That's a huge brain drain.
It's a massive brain drain.
Yeah.
It deprives the country of its most valuable resource, its human capital. And while those remittances do keep households afloat, they prevent an immediate crisis, maybe. They mostly go towards consumption, buying goods, often imported goods, not into productive investment that could build the economy long term.
So it doesn't really build future growth.
Exactly. It leads to economic stagnation in many ways. The domestic production sector, especially agriculture, tends to deteriorate because labor is scarce or imports are cheaper. And the tax base narrows, further weakening the state's ability to invest in its own future in education, healthcare infrastructure. It really is a vicious cycle.
And to compound all of that, Nepal faces severe climate vulnerability. The sources rank it 10th on the Global Climate Risk Index. That's incredibly high.
It is. And climate change directly hits two foundational pillars of its economy. First, agriculture. Irregular monsoons, droughts, devastating floods are causing huge crop losses. Second, hydropower. Melting glaciers are altering river flows. And there's the terrifying threat of glacial lake outburst floods, GLOFs. These can literally wipe out multi-million-dollar power plants and downstream communities overnight.
GLOFs, wow, that sounds catastrophic.
It is. The World Bank projects that economic losses just from climate change impacts could be between 2.2% and maybe even 7% of Nepal's GDP annually by 2050.
Huge numbers.
Massive. And over the past 5 years alone, the estimated economic loss from climate-related disasters has already been over 415 billion Nepalese rupees, according to government figures cited.
Yeah.
So these political, economic, and climate factors, they're not separate issues. They're deeply intertwined. They feed each other, creating this vicious circle that ensures Nepal's dependence on foreign aid and perpetuates the great game being played out on its soil. Slow economic growth, high youth unemployment, critical dependence on remittances, combined with severe climate risks, they all paint a really clear picture of these deep internal fault lines. It makes navigating the external pressures that much harder.
Right. This complex interplay of external ambitions and these really deep internal weaknesses, it puts Nepal at such a critical crossroads. Its future isn't set in stone, as you said. It seems like a set of probabilities depending on whose strategy, India's, China's, the US's, is more successful, and maybe most importantly, whether Kathmandu can somehow find the strength to transform itself from within. Our sources identify three main long-term scenarios based on these dynamics. What are they?
Okay, the first one the analysis outlines is Indian encirclement, or you could call it strategic subordination. In this scenario, basically, India successfully leverages all its built-in advantages, its geography, its economic might, the cultural ties, Nepal's water dependency to really solidify its dominance. New Delhi manages to effectively block significant Chinese investment in crucial sectors like hydropower, and maybe U.S. involvement scales back or becomes less relevant. China's broader ambitions in Nepal are contained.
And the result for Nepal in that
The
scenario.
result, well, Nepal probably gains some level of economic prosperity, maybe through better integration with the Indian economy, but it comes at the clear cost of genuine strategic autonomy. It becomes richer, perhaps, but certainly less sovereign. It evolves into what the sources describe as maybe a reliable but subservient Indian outpost.
Okay, that's scenario one. What's the second possibility?
The second scenario is labeled China's embrace, or maybe risky diversification. This becomes more likely if persistent Indian pressure becomes too much for Kathmandu to bear, or if there's a complete, sustained withdrawal of Western aid and engagement, like we saw threatened with the MCC suspension. A frustrated Nepal might then make a decisive turn toward Beijing, really banking on Chinese loans for those truly transformative large-scale projects like that ambitious Trans-Himalayan Railway. The goal would be to fundamentally break its dependence on India.
And the outcome there sounds like a big gamble.
It's a huge gamble. The result would likely be rapid infrastructure development, the kind Nepal hasn't seen in decades, which could be very appealing. But, and it's a big but, it comes at a very high price. Likely severe debt dependence on China, which inevitably translates into powerful political influence for Beijing. Relations with India would probably deteriorate sharply, turning Nepal from its traditional buffer state role into more of a frontline state, an arena for direct geopolitical confrontation between India and China. Its economic growth would be quite fragile, heavily dependent on Beijing's political goodwill, and its overall security situation could become much more precarious.
Okay, a risky path. And the third scenario, you mentioned earlier, this might be the most likely.
Yes. The third scenario presented, and the one often seen as the most probable, is called dangerous balance, or perhaps motion by inertia. This is basically where Nepal just continues its chaotic, often fragile balancing act. It hesitates to commit fully to any one side. Governments keep changing rapidly, as they have been. Politicians use external actors in their projects for short-term political games back home. And projects from all sides, Indian, Chinese, maybe some Western, they progress very slowly, incrementally, without bringing about any real transformative change to the country's structure.
So kind of muddling through.
Exactly. Muddling through is a good way to put it. The result of this scenario is that Nepal manages to avoid being completely absorbed or dominated by any single power. It maintains a semblance of independence, but it pays for that with pervasive stagnation. That vulnerability vortex we talked about just keeps spinning. Political instability continues to slow development. The economy fails to create enough jobs for its young people, so they keep leaving. Climate threats only grow more severe and less manageable. External forces continue to meddle in domestic affairs with relative ease because the state remains weak. Nepal doesn't exactly lose the game in this scenario, but it doesn't really win either. It finds itself stuck in a state of perpetual stalemate, remaining weak, dependent, and extremely vulnerable to any future external shocks or internal crises.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive really lays it bare, doesn't it? Nepal is right at the center of this geopolitical storm. It's a high-stakes game with India, China, and the U.S. all as formidable players, each with their own complex strategies and inherent risks for Nepal itself.
Absolutely. But the main conclusion that comes through really clearly from this analysis from all these sources is this. While these great powers are certainly arranging the pieces on the board, the truly decisive moves are ultimately left to Nepal itself. The key to escaping that classic yam between two boulders dilemma doesn't lie solely in its foreign policy choices, tilting towards India or China or the West. The real key, the analysis argues, is in urgently building its own domestic strength and resilience from within. tackling those internal cracks.
And that leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, our listener. We want you to think about this. Given Nepal's deep internal cracks, that chronic political instability, the fragile remittance-based economy and youth exodus, and its acute climate vulnerability, what specific reforms do you think are the most critical for Nepal to break free from being just a pawn and maybe, finally, become a player in its own right? If you had to prioritize, would it be achieving genuine political stability first? Would it be laser focusing on creating a dynamic domestic economy that provides good jobs? Or would it be pouring resources into effective climate change adaptation to protect its future? Which one of those would you tackle first? Something to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.